The late 1870s had been unkind to Wyoming territory. 3 harsh winters in a row had claimed livestock, broken spirits, and left the rolling plains dotted with abandoned homesteads like tombstones against the endless sky. Wyatt Reed had weathered them all, but each season carved deeper lines into his weathered face and added fresh aches to joints that remembered better days. His ranch sat on a plateau overlooking Sweetwater Creek, where cottonwoods grew thick and the grass stayed green even in drought years. It was good land the kind men killed for, but it felt hollow now. Empty rooms echoed with memories of laughter that would never return. Clara's sewing basket still sat beside the fireplace, her thimble gathering dust on the mantel. Little Sarah's wooden doll watched from the windowsill with painted eyes that seemed to follow him through his daily routines. The fever had taken them, both in the space of 2 weeks during the terrible winter of '76. First Sarah, barely 8 years old, burning up despite every remedy he and Clara tried. Then Clara herself, worn down by grief and exhaustion, succumbing to the same merciless sickness that had claimed their daughter. Wyatt had buried them both beneath the old oak tree on the hill, marking their graves with stones he'd carved himself. The words were simple: beloved wife and mother, and our little angel. Words felt insufficient for the magnitude of his loss. Since then, the ranch had become his refuge and his prison. He tended his cattle, mended fences, and maintained the buildings with methodical precision, but the work felt mechanical, devoid of the purpose it once held. Neighbors rarely visited anymore, partly because the nearest homestead was 15 miles away, and partly because Wyatt had grown distant, speaking only when spoken to, his smile a rare and fleeting thing. The evening wind carried the scent of approaching autumn as Wyatt stepped onto his porch, coffee cup warming his calloused hands. The sun hung low and red above the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. It was beautiful, he supposed, but beauty felt like something that belonged to other people, now folks who still had reason to notice such things. Ah, Mari whinnied from the corral, drawing his attention. The bay had been acting skittish all day, pacing the fence line and tossing her head at shadows. Wyatt frowned, setting down his cup. Animals knew things before people did sense storms, predators, trouble brewing on the horizon. He'd learned to trust their instincts during his years on this land. As he walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the dry grass, Wyatt felt that familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of being completely, utterly alone. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt oppressive, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. He'd grown so accustomed to solitude that he sometimes went days without speaking aloud, his voice growing rusty from disuse. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and leather enveloped him like an old coat. He checked the Mari's stall, running experienced hands along the wooden rails, looking for splinters or loose boards that might explain her agitation. Everything appeared sound, but the animal continued to pace, ears swiveling toward the old storage shed that sat behind the main building. Wyatt had built that shed with his father nearly 20 years ago, back when the ranch was young and full of promise. They'd used it to store feed, tools, and supplies during the lean months. Now it mostly held forgotten items, broken equipment he'd been meaning to fix, Clara's old preserving jars, memories he couldn't quite bring himself to throw away. Standing in the doorway of the barn, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon, Wyatt felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle deeper into his bones. Tomorrow would bring the same routine. Coffee at dawn, checking the cattle, mending whatever needed fixing, eating a solitary supper by lamplight. It was a life measured in small tasks and quiet endurance, stretching endlessly toward a future that held no particular promise or hope. But tonight's, something felt different. The Mari's restlessness, the strange quality of the light, the way the wind seemed to whisper warnings he couldn't quite understand, All of it pointed toward change coming, whether welcome or not. Wyatt Reed had learned that on the frontier, change usually meant trouble. But after 2 years of numbness and isolation, even trouble might be better than the suffocating sameness of his solitary existence. He closed the barn door and headed back toward the house, unaware that his life was about to be transformed by a voice in the darkness, calling out from a place where no voice should be. The wind had been building all evening, rattling the shutters and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard like restless spirits. Wyatt sat by his fireplace, trying to focus on the week-old newspaper from Cheyenne, but the words blurred together on the page. Outside, something was banging against the barn, probably a loose board he'd need to nail down come morning. He just decided to turn in, early when he heard it again, the Mari's distressed whinnying, sharp and urgent. With a weary sigh, Wyatt set down the paper and reached for his coat. Animals didn't fuss without reason, and leaving a spooked horse to injure herself would be foolish economy. The night air hit him like a slap, cold and sharp with the promise of an early winter. His lantern cast a small circle of wavering light as he crossed the yard, boots crunching on frost-brittle grass. The Mari was pacing frantically in her stall, eyes rolling white in the lamplight, foam speckling her muzzle. "Easy, girl," Wyatt murmured, his voice rusty from hours of silence. "What's got you so worked up?" He examined the stall carefully, running his hands along every surface, checking for anything that might have startled her. The wood was solid, the hay fresh, the water clean. But the Mari continued her agitated dance, snorting and tossing her head toward the back wall toward the old shed. That's when he heard it dot at first. He thought it was just the wind playing tricks, creating voices in the creaking timber and whistling air. But then it came again, faint but unmistakably human. "Please, please open it. I can't breathe." Wyatt's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He grabbed his rifle from its place beside the barn door and stepped into the wind, lantern held high. The voice had come from the direction of the storage shed, but that was impossible. He'd locked that building himself weeks ago, and the key hung on a nail inside his kitchen. "Please," the voice came again, weaker now, desperate. I can't breathe." It was a woman's voice, young, filled with terror and pain. Wyatt's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had someone broken into his shed? Was this a trap? Bandits were known to use women as bait, playing on a man's instinct to help. But the anguish in that voice sounded too real to be acting. He approached the shed cautiously, rifle ready, every sense alert. The building loomed dark against the starlit sky, its doors hanging slightly ajar despite the chain and padlock that should have secured them. The chain lay on the ground, cut clean through. "Hello?" He called out, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Who's there?" A sob answered him, choked and desperate. "Please, help me, ... double quotes. Wyatt pushed the door open wider, lantern flame dancing wildly in the gusting wind. The smell hit him immediately, fierce sweat, blood, and something else. Something that spoke of captivity and abuse. In the far corner, behind a stack of grain sacks, something moved. His heart hammering against his ribs, Wyatt stepped closer. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A large burlap sack, the kind used for feed, but it was moving, writhing with obvious human form. The top was tied with rope, knotted so tightly it would take a knife to cut through. "Dear God," he whispered, setting down the rifle and lantern. His fingers worked frantically at the knots, rough hemp cutting into his skin. The person inside the sack had gone still, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might be too late. Then a weak cough emerged, followed by the sound of labored breathing. The rope finally gave way, and Wyatt pulled the sack open. A young woman's face appeared in the lamplight pale, bruised, her lips cracked and bleeding. Matted blonde hair stuck to her cheeks, and her blue eyes stared up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I'm not going to hurt you," Wyatt said gently, his hands shaking as he worked to free her completely from the sack. "You're safe now. You're safe." She tried to sit up and cried out in pain, clutching her ribs. In the lantern light, Wyatt could see the extent of her injuries: rope burns on her wrists, bruises on her arms and face, cuts that spoke of rough handling and worse. Someone had hurt this girl badly, then left her here to die. "What's her name?" he asked, shrugging out of his coat to wrap around her shoulders. "Lydia," she managed, teeth chattering from cold and shock. "Lydia Sawyer. Well, Miss Sawyer, I'm Wyatt Reed, and this is my land. Can you tell me who did this to you?" Her eyes filled with tears. "3 men. Maybe 4. They took me from the wagon train 3 days ago. Said they were going to sell me." Her voice broke. "Said I'd fetch a good price because I was clean." Rage flared in Wyatt's chest, hot and righteous. He'd heard rumors of such things: men who prey on travelers, stealing women and girls to sell in the lawless territories. But hearing it from this broken girl's lips made it real in a way that turned his stomach. "They left you here?" "Got spooked," Lydia whispered. "Thought someone was following them. One of them said they'd come back for me when things cooled down." She grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Please don't let them take me again. Please. Nobody's taking you anywhere," Wyatt said firmly. "You have my word on that." He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was too light, as if she hadn't eaten properly in days. As he carried her toward the house, her head lolled against his shoulder, and he felt the trust of someone who had no choice but to trust. It was a weight he hadn't carried in 2 years, the responsibility for another human being's life and safety. Behind them, the wind howled through the empty shed, erasing all traces of the nightmare that had been hidden there. But Wyatt knew this was just the beginning. Men who dealt in human misery didn't simply forget their merchandise. They would be back, and when they came, they'd find Wyatt Reed waiting for them. For the first time since Clara and Sarah died, he had something worth fighting for. The first gray light of dawn found Wyatt standing at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the horizon. Lydia slept fitfully on the cot he'd set up near the fireplace, wrapped in Clara's old quilts. Every few minutes she would whimper or cry out, trapped in nightmares that sleep couldn't ease. He'd spent the night in the wooden chair beside her, rifle across his knees, listening to every sound the wind carried. Twice he'd gone outside to circle the property, checking for signs that unwelcome visitors had returned. So far, they remained alone, but Wyatt's instincts told him that wouldn't last dawn when Lydia finally stirred. Her eyes flew open with the startled alertness of someone who'd learned to wake afraid. It took her a moment to remember where she was, to recognize the safety of the warm room and the steady presence of the man who'd pulled her from that suffocating darkness. "Morning," Wyatt said quietly, setting down his cup. "How are you feeling?" She tried to sit up, wincing as her injuries protested. "Sore, but alive." Her voice was stronger than it had been the night before, though still rough. "Thank you. Thank you. For everything. No need for thanks." Any decent person would have done the same. But even as he said it, Wyatt knew it wasn't entirely true. The frontier was full of men who would have looked the other way, who would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. The fact that he'd acted without hesitation surprised him. He'd thought that part of himself had died with his family. He fixed her a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, food that would be gentle on a stomach that had known too little lately. As she ate, color slowly returned to her cheeks, and he could see hints of the pretty young woman she'd been before terror and abuse had marked her. "The wagon train," he said carefully. "Where were you headed?" "Oregon. My uncle has a farm there. Said he could use help with the harvest." Lydia's voice carried the weight of lost dreams. "My parents died of cholera last spring. Uncle Benjamin was the only family I had left. How many days out from Cheyenne when they took you?" 4, maybe 5. "We were camped by Willow Creek." She set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "I was gathering firewood when they came up behind me. Put a sack over my head before I could even scream." Wyatt knew Willow Creek. It was a common camping spot for wagon trains, with good water and grass for the animals. It was also isolated, a perfect place for predators to strike without witnesses. "Can you describe them?" Lydia closed her eyes, her hands trembling slightly. The leader was tall, thin, with a scar running from his left ear to his mouth. Mean eyes, like a snake. "He's the one who said I'd bring a good price." She shuddered. The others? One was young, couldn't have been more than 20. The third was older, gray-bearded, with hands like ham hocks. "Did they say where they were taking you?" "Fort Rock. There's a saloon there that buys girls." The words came out in a whisper, as if speaking them too loudly might make them more real. Wyatt's jaw clenched. He knew Fort Rock, a rough mining town where law was whatever the man with the biggest gun said it was. If these men were connected to the trade there, Lydia wouldn't be their first victim, and she wouldn't be their last. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the distant rumble of approaching horses. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. 3 riders were coming up the main trail, moving at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. "Get in the back room," he told Lydia quietly. "Stay there until I come for you." Her face had gone white. "Is it them?" "I don't know. But we're not taking chances." She disappeared into the bedroom, and Wyatt heard the soft sound of the window being opened. Smart girl, giving herself another way out if things went badly. He positioned himself by the front window where he could see the approaching riders while remaining mostly hidden. They stopped at his front gate, and Wyatt's blood chilled as he recognized the leader. Tall and thin with a livid scar dividing his face, exactly as Lydia had described. The man sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. "Morning, friend," the scarred man called out. "Fine day, isn't it?" Wyatt stepped onto his porch, but kept the rifle ready. "Morning. Something I can do for you, gentlemen?" "Maybe so. We're looking for some property that went missing a few days back. Valuable property. You understand." "Can't say I do." The scarred man's smile was cold as winter. "Young woman, blonde hair, blue eyes. Pretty little thing. Her family's real worried about her. Haven't seen anyone matching that description." "That's curious," said the younger rider, his hand resting on his gumbutt. "Because we tracked her this way, and tracks don't lie." "Tracks can be misleading," Wyatt replied evenly. "Lot of wildlife moves through here. Easy to mistake a deer path for something else." The older man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You sure about that, mister? Because we'd be real grateful to anyone who helped us find our missing girl. Grateful enough to share the reward her family's offering. And we'd be real disappointed in anyone who didn't," added the scarred man, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. Wyatt felt the familiar calm that had served him well during his years as a deputy marshal, before Clara and the ranch had claimed his attention. "Like I said, haven't seen anyone. But if I do, I'll be sure to let the proper authorities know." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Wyatt could see them calculating odds, measuring his resolve. They were predators, but they were also businessmen who preferred easy prey to unnecessary risks. "Well," the scarred man said finally, "if she does turn up, you can find us at the Broken Wheel Saloon in Fort Rock. We'll be there for a few more days. Then we move on. I'll keep that in mind." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, but Wyatt noticed they didn't head back the way they'd come. Instead, they circled toward the eastern ridge, where they could watch his ranch without being seen. They weren't giving up. They were just changing tactics. When he was sure they were gone, Wyatt called Lydia back to the main room. Her face was pale but determined, and he saw something new in her eyes, not just fear, but anger. "They're not going away, are they?" She said, "No, they're not." "Then what do we do?" Wyatt looked at this young woman who'd already survived more than most people could imagine, who'd found the strength to hope even after being left to die. For the first time in 2 years, he felt the old fire stirring in his chest, the need to protect, to fight, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. "We get ready," he said, "because they'll be back, and when they come, we'll be waiting." 2 days passed in tense preparation. Wyatt moved through his daily routine with the methodical precision of a man expecting trouble, while Lydia gradually regained her strength. She proved to be more resilient than her fragile appearance suggested, helping with simple chores despite her injuries and never once complaining about the pain that still marked her movements. The watchers on the ridge remained, though they kept their distance. Wyatt caught glimpses of them through his spyglass, at least 3 men taking turns surveying his ranch. They were patient, professional, waiting for the right moment to make their move. On the 3rd morning, that moment came. Wyatt woke before dawn to find frost covering the windows and his breath misting in the cold air. Winter was coming early this year, and the chill seemed to penetrate even the warmest corners of the house. He was building up the fire when he heard horses approaching, not 3 this time, but more. Many more. He counted 8 riders as they spread out around his property, moving with military precision to surround the ranch house. The scarred man sat his horse at the front gate, but now he was flanked by hard-faced men with the look of professional killers. This wasn't a negotiation party. It was a war band. "Reed," the scarred man shouted. "We know she's in there. Send her out, and nobody needs to get hurt." Wyatt checked his weapons one final time, his rifle, his revolver, and the shotgun he'd positioned by the back door. It wasn't enough firepower to hold off 8 men indefinitely, but it might be enough to make them pay dearly for what they wanted. "What makes you think I've got anyone here but myself?" He called back, "Because we've been watching. Saw you hanging 2 sets of clothes on a line yesterday. Saw smoke coming from the chimney at times when you should have been out working. You're not near as clever as you think, old man." The insult stung, but Wyatt had learned long ago not to let anger cloud his judgment. He moved to the back room where Lydia waited, her face pale but resolute. "There's too many of them," he said quietly. "I can hold them off for a while, but—" "No." Her voice was firm, surprising him with its strength. "I won't hide while you die for me, Miss Sawyer. Lydia, and I mean it." She stood up, moving carefully but with determination. "I'd been running and hiding for days. I'm tired of being afraid." Before he could stop her, she walked to the front window and called out to the men surrounding the house. "I'm here, but I'm not coming out." The scarred man's laugh was ugly. "You don't have a choice, little bird. Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Stay in there, and we'll burn you out. Either way, you're coming with us." "Like hell she is," Wyatt muttered, positioning himself at the window with his rifle. What happened next changed everything. Lydia walked to the kitchen and returned with a large knife, the same one she'd used to cut vegetables for their simple meals. But now she held it like a weapon, her knuckles wide around the handle. "They want me?" she said, loud enough for the men outside to hear. "They can have me, but not alive. I'd rather die here with a good man trying to protect me than live another day as their prisoner." She pressed the blade to her own throat, and Wyatt saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold, not desperation, but absolute, unshakable resolve. "You're bluffing," the scarred man called, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Am I?" Lydia pressed the knife harder, and a thin line of blood appeared on her pale skin. "I've got nothing left to lose. You took that from me when you stuffed me in that sack and left me to die. Wyatt reached out slowly, carefully. "Lydia, don't. I won't go back to that," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't." In that moment, Wyatt Reed felt something break open inside his chest. Not despair, but fury. Pure, righteous rage at men who could drive a young woman to such extremes, who could make death seem preferable to whatever they had planned for her. "Put the knife down," he said gently. "Please." "Why? So they can take me anyway?" "No." His voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. "So I can keep my promise to you." She looked at him with those impossibly blue eyes, searching his face for something she could believe in. "What promise?" "That nobody would take you from this ranch. That you'd be safe here." He moved closer, his hand covering hers on the knife handle. "I gave you my word, and a man's only as good as his word." For a long moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, the knife between them, the armed men outside, the weight of promises and desperation hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Lydia's grip loosened, and the knife clattered to the floor. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," Wyatt admitted. "But we'll face it together." Outside, the scarred man was growing impatient. "Time's up. Come out now, or we start shooting." Wyatt moved to the window, his rifle ready. "You want her? Come and take her." The first shot shattered the glass beside his head, and suddenly, the morning erupted in gunfire. Bullets splintered the wooden walls, and smoke filled the air as both sides opened fire in earnest. But something had changed. In Wyatt Reed, for the first time since Clara and Sarah died, he had someone worth fighting for, someone whose life depended on his strength and skill. The numbness that had wrapped around his heart like a shroud fell away, replaced by the fierce protectiveness he thought he'd lost forever. He was no longer just surviving. He was defending his home, and the woman who'd reminded him what it meant to be alive thought the gunfight lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the ranch house, sending splinters flying and filling the air with smoke and sawdust. Wyatt moved from window to window with practiced efficiency, using every bit of cover the house provided while returning fire with deadly accuracy. He'd learned to shoot during his younger days as a deputy marshal, and those skills came flooding back now when they mattered most. His first shot took down the man positioned near the barn, sending him tumbling from his horse with a cry of pain. His second wounded one of the riders trying to flank the house from the north. But 8 against 1 were impossible odds, even for a man fighting for his life. They had him surrounded, and ammunition wouldn't last forever. Lydia surprised him by how calmly she handled the chaos. Instead of cowering in terror, she moved through the house like someone who'd found her purpose, reloading weapons and gathering supplies. When a bullet shattered the water pitcher, she simply swept up the pieces and moved the remaining water to safety. "How many?" she asked during a brief lull in the firing. 6 left, Wyatt replied, pressing his back against the wall as he reloaded. "Maybe 5? That's still too many." "Yeah, it is." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, what if we even the odds? Before he could ask what she meant, she'd moved to the back of the house where Clara's old trunk sat beneath the bedroom window. From it, she pulled a faded blue dress and a woman's hat with a wide brim. "What are you doing?" Creating a distraction, she held up the dress. "They want me alive, right? For the money?" "Lydia, no. Listen to me." Her voice carried an authority that made him stop and pay attention. "They think I'm helpless, just a frightened girl they can recapture whenever they want. What if I'm not?" She explained her plan quickly, and despite every instinct screaming against it, Wyatt had to admit it might work. It was dangerous, terrifyingly so, but it might be their only chance. They waited for the next lull in the gunfire. Then Lydia positioned herself at the back window while Wyatt created noise at the front of the house. She climbed through the window wearing Clara's dress and hat, moving in a crouched run toward the old well that sat 30 yards from the house. The ruse worked. Two of the attackers saw the blue dress and immediately gave chase, thinking she was trying to escape. They rode hard toward the well, guns drawn but not firing. After all, damaged goods brought less money. That's when Wyatt made his move. He burst through the front door, rifle blazing, catching the remaining attackers off guard. In the confusion of the moment, with some of their number chasing what they thought was their quarry, the ambush fell apart. Wyatt's shots were true. One man fell from his horse immediately, clutching a shattered shoulder. Another tried to wheel around and retreat, but took a bullet in the leg that sent him tumbling into the dirt. But the scarred leader was quicker than the others, and more experienced. He realized the deception almost immediately, and spun his horse toward the well where Lydia was supposed to be hiding Dodd instead. He found empty air in the crack of a rifle shot. Lydia had positioned herself behind the well's stone wall, and in her hands was Clara's old hunting rifle, a weapon Wyatt had taught his wife to use during their early years on the ranch. The shot took the scarred man's hat clean off his head and convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. "Fall back," he shouted to his remaining men. "Fall back." The surviving attackers retreated, gathering their wounded and riding hard toward the eastern ridge. But Wyatt knew this wasn't over. It was just the first round dot as the dust settled. He ran toward the well where Lydia waited, her face flushed with adrenaline and something that might have been pride. "You all right?" he called out. "Still breathing," she replied, then added with a shaky smile, "Still free." They walked back to the house together, surveying the damage. The walls were pocked with bullet holes, 2 windows were shattered, and the front door hung askew on its hinges. But the structure was sound, and more importantly, they were both alive. "They'll be back," Lydia said, stating the obvious. "Yes, they will, but not today." Wyatt reloaded his rifle methodically. "And maybe not tomorrow either. We hurt them, and they'll need time to lick their wounds and plan their next move. What do we do in the meantime?" "We get ready. Really ready." He looked at her with new respect. "That was brave, what you did out there. Foolish maybe, but brave." "I was tired of being afraid," she said simply. "And I was tired of letting other people fight my battles." That night, as they worked together to repair the damage and reinforce their defenses, Wyatt found himself seeing Lydia differently. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a partner, someone with her own strength and determination. The frightened girl he'd pulled from the burlap sack was still there, but she was joined now by someone harder, more resilient, someone who might just survive what was coming. Dodd, as they sat by the fire late that evening, sharing a simple meal and planning for the next attack, Wyatt realized that something fundamental had changed. For the first time since Clara and Sarah died, he wasn't just existing from day to day. He had a purpose again, a reason to fight. And sitting across from him, mending bullet holes in Clara's old dress by lamplight, was the woman who'd given it back to him. Word traveled fast across the Wyoming territory, carried by traveling merchants, drifters, and anyone else who made their living on the dusty roads between settlements. Within a week, the story of the siege at Reed's Ranch had reached every saloon, trading post, and sheriff's office within 100 miles. Most folks heard it as entertainment, a sheriff's office within 100 miles. Tale of 8 armed men driven off by a lone rancher and a kidnapped girl. But some heard it differently. Some heard it as an opportunity. Samuel Morrison, the territorial marshal based out of Cheyenne, heard it as a chance for justice. Morrison was a weathered man in his 50s, with gray threading his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years chasing bad men across unforgiving country. He'd known Wyatt Reed during the younger man's brief stint as a deputy, and he'd always respected Reed's steady nerve and quick thinking. When the story reached him, Morrison was investigating reports of missing women along the Oregon Trail, reports that had, been coming in with disturbing frequency over the past 2 years. Young women vanishing from wagon trains, their families told they'd wandered off and gotten lost. But Morrison had been a lawman too long to believe in that many coincidences. He rode out to Reed's ranch on a crisp October morning, bringing with him 2 deputies and a wagon load of questions. Wyatt met them at his repaired front gate, rifle in hand but pointed groundward, a gesture of caution rather than hostility. The bullet holes in his house told their own story, and Morrison could see that the reports hadn't been exaggerated. "Marshal Morrison," Wyatt said with a nod. "Heard you might be coming." "Wyatt, hell of a thing you've got yourself mixed up in. Wasn't exactly my choice." Morrison dismounted, his deputies following suit. "Mind if we talk? I've got some questions that need answering." They sat on Wyatt's porch while Lydia remained inside, listening through the open window. Morrison was direct but respectful, asking about the attack, the men involved, and what Lydia had told him about her kidnapping. "This scarred fellow," Morrison said, making notes in a leather-bound book. "You'd recognize him again?" "Absolutely. Face like that isn't easily forgotten." "Good, because I think he's the same man who's been hitting wagon trains from here to Fort Laramie. We've had reports of at least a dozen missing women in the past 2 years. All young, all pretty, all vanished without a trace." Wyatt felt his jaw clench. "How many others like Lydia?" "Too many. And most of them weren't lucky enough to have someone like you find them." Morrison closed his book and looked directly at Wyatt. "I need your help with this." "What kind of help?" "The kind that might get you killed if we're not careful. But the kind that could save a lot of innocent women if we are." Morrison outlined his plan as the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky. The territorial government was finally taking the missing women seriously, largely because some of the victims had been from influential families back east. They were authorizing a special operation to break up the trafficking ring, and they needed someone on the inside, someone the criminals would trust. "You want me to go undercover?" Wyatt said. "Not exactly. I want you to be bait." The plan was audacious and dangerous. Wyatt would take Lydia to Fort Rock, ostensibly to sell her to the same saloon where the kidnappers had intended to take her. He'd pose as a man down on his luck, desperate enough to traffic in human misery for the right price. Morrison and his men would be waiting nearby, ready to move in once they'd identified the key players in the operation. "It's risky," Morrison admitted. "If they recognize either of you, or if something goes wrong, they'll kill us both." Wyatt finished. "Probably." There was a long silence as Wyatt considered the proposal. From inside the house came the soft sound of Lydia moving around, and he thought about what she'd already endured. Could he ask her to walk back into that nightmare voluntarily? "I'll need to talk to her," he said finally. "Of course. But Wyatt, time's not on our side here. My sources say they're planning to move their operation soon, maybe as early as next week. If we don't act now, we might lose our chance." When Morrison and his deputies left, Wyatt found Lydia sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap. She'd heard everything, of course. "You think it's our only chance, don't you?" she said before he could speak. "I think it's the best chance to stop them from hurting other women the way they hurt you." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the hills where autumn was painting the aspens gold. "I keep thinking about the other girls they mentioned, the ones they've already sold." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What happened to them?" "I don't know. But you can guess." He could, and the possibilities made his stomach turn. "Lydia, I won't ask you to do this. The risk is mine to take." She looked at him with those clear blue eyes. "You saved my life, Wyatt. Maybe it's time I helped save someone else's." They spent the next 3 days preparing. Morrison sent word through unofficial channels that a rancher near Sweetwater Creek was looking to make some quick money selling a woman he'd found on his property. The story was believable enough, Men had sold their wives and daughters before when times got desperate, and Wyatt's ranch was isolated enough that few people would question how he'd come by such merchandise. Lydia proved to be surprisingly good at playing the part of a broken captive. She could make herself appear defeated and hopeless when needed, but Wyatt caught glimpses of steel beneath the performance. She was planning something, he could tell, but when he asked her about it, she just smiled and said she was learning to think like they did. On the appointed day, they rode out before dawn. Lydia sat behind him on his horse, her hands loosely bound with rope that she could slip out of in seconds. She wore a torn dress and had dirt smudged on her face to complete the illusion. But underneath the costume was a small knife and a derringer that Morrison had provided. Fort Rock squatted in a valley between two barren hills, like a carbuncle on the landscape. It was everything ugly about frontier life, concentrated into one festering settlement, hastily built wooden buildings, muddy streets filled with horse manure and garbage, and the kind of men who came to places like this because civilized society wouldn't have them. The Broken Wheel Saloon sat in the center of town, a two-story building with peeling paint and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. Music and laughter spilled out into the street, but it was the harsh kind of laughter that came from desperation rather than joy. Wyatt tied his horse to the hitching post and helped Lydia down, keeping up the pretense of a man handling valuable property. Several passers-by stopped to stare, and he could feel their eyes measuring, calculating. Inside, the saloon was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. A piano played somewhere in the back, competing with the sound of men drinking and gambling their lives away. At a corner table sat the scarred man from the attack on the ranch, and when he saw Wyatt walk in with Lydia, his eyes went wide with surprise and then narrow with calculation. "Well, well," he said, rising from his chair. "Look what the wind blew in. Heard you might be interested in making a deal," Wyatt said, his voice carrying just the right note of desperate greed. The scarred man, who introduced himself as Jacob, Cartwright smiled that cold smile. "Depends on what you're selling, friend. The same thing you tried to take from me 2 weeks ago. Only now I'm willing to negotiate." Cartwright's eyes flicked to Lydia, who stood with her head down and her shoulders slumped in apparent defeat. "What changed your mind?" "Bank foreclosure. Turns out defending my property cost me more than it was worth." Wyatt let bitterness creep into his voice. "A man's got to eat, and she's worth more than my cattle at this point." It was a believable story, and Cartwright seemed to buy it. He circled around Lydia like a man examining a horse, and Wyatt had to fight the urge to put his fist through the bastard's teeth. "She looks a little worse for wear," Cartwright observed. "That fight of yours left some marks. Nothing that won't heal. And she's learned not to cause trouble. Has she now?" Cartwright grabbed Lydia's chin, forcing her to look up at him. "What do you say, little bird? You ready to be a good girl?" What happened next took everyone by surprise. Instead of answering, Lydia spat directly in Cartwright's face. The saloon went dead quiet. Cartwright wiped the spittle away slowly, his expression murderous. "Seems like she hasn't learned much at all. She's just scared," Wyatt said quickly, grabbing Lydia's arm. "I'll handle her." But Lydia had her own plan. "You can all go to hell," she said loudly enough for the whole saloon to hear. "I'd rather die than let any of you touch me." It was exactly what a terrified, defiant girl would say, and exactly what Cartwright expected to hear. His smile returned, colder than before. "Oh, you'll learn," he said softly. "We've got ways of teaching girls like you to mind their manners. Bring her upstairs. I want to inspect the merchandise properly before we discuss price." As they headed toward the narrow staircase at the back of the saloon, Wyatt caught a glimpse of movement outside the grimy windows. Morrison and his men were in position. Now came the most dangerous part, getting close enough to the operations leadership to identify all the players before the shooting started, because shooting was inevitable. Men like Cartwright didn't surrender quietly, and they had too much to lose to go peacefully. Before this day was over, blood would be spilled on the sawdust floor of the Broken Wheel Saloon. Wyatt only hoped it wouldn't be Lydia's. The upstairs room smelled of stale whiskey and despair. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and a single grimy window looked out onto the main street below. Cartwright gestured for Wyatt to push Lydia into a chair while he examined her like a piece of livestock. Pretty enough, he mused, running a finger along her jawline while she flinched away. Young. That's good. The clients prefer them young. But I'm concerned about her spirit. Broken merchandise is easier to manage. She break, Wyatt said, hating every word. Give her a few days without food. Lock her in a room with some of the rougher customers. She learn. Cartwright laughed. You talk like a man who's done this before. Times have been hard. A man does what he has to do. From somewhere downstairs came the sound of chairs scraping and boots on wooden floors. The subtle movements of men taking positions. Morrison's deputies were filtering into the saloon, posing as customers. Soon it would be time to act. 500? Cartwright said suddenly. 500? She's worth twice that, and you know it. Not with that attitude. She isn't. But I'll tell you what, I'll make it 700 if you throw in something extra. What kind of extra? Cartwright's smile was pure evil. Information. About the marshal who's been sniffing around, asking questions about missing women. Word is you talked to him. Wyatt felt ice form in his veins. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Samuel Morrison, territorial marshal out of Cheyenne. He came to your ranch 3 days ago with 2 deputies. My sources saw him. The trap was closing, but not the way they planned. Somehow, Cartwright had learned about the operation, which meant Morrison and his men might be walking into an ambush of their own. Look, Wyatt said, trying to buy time. I don't know anything about any marshal. I don't know anything about any marshal. All I want is to sell the girl and get out of here. I'm afraid that's not going to happen. Cartwright drew his pistol in one smooth motion, pointing it at Lydia's head. You see, Mr. Reed. Yes, I know who you are. I've been in this business too long to trust coincidences. A girl escapes from us, shows up at your ranch. You fight off my men, and then a few days later the territorial marshal comes calling. That's not coincidence. That's a setup. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made everyone freeze. Heavy boots, too many of them, coming up fast. Morrison's men or Cartwright's. There was no way to know. Jacob. A voice called from below. We got company. Federal marshals. Cartwright's face twisted with rage. You son of a bitch. You led them right to us. Actually, Lydia said quietly, we did. Before anyone could react, she'd slipped her bonds and drawn the small derringer from her dress. The barrel was pressed against Cartwright's ribs before he could blink. Now here's what's going to happen, she said, her voice steady as granite. You're going to put your gun down, and you're going to tell those men downstairs to surrender. Because if you don't, I'm going to put a bullet through your heart. Cartwright laughed, but there was nervousness in it now. You don't have the nerve, little bird, don't I? Her eyes were blue ice. You want to bet your life on that? The standoff lasted 5 seconds. Then gunfire erupted from downstairs, shouts, breaking glass, the crash of overturned furniture. Morrison's men had moved in, and Cartwright's people were fighting back in the chaos. Cartwright made his move. He spun away from Lydia's gun, swinging his own weapon toward Wyatt. But he'd forgotten that Wyatt Reed had once been a lawman, and some instincts never fade. Wyatt's shot took Cartwright in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying across the room. The man crashed into the wall and slid down, clutching his wounded arm and cursing. It's over, Wyatt said, his smoking gun trained on the fallen man. Like hell it is, Cartwright snarled. You think we're the only ones in this business? You think killing me stops anything?" From his coat pocket, he pulled a folded paper and threw it at Wyatt's feet. "Take a look at that, hero. See how many girls we've moved through here in the past 2 years. See how much money we've made." Wyatt picked up the paper with his free hand, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a ledger of sorts, listing names, dates, and amounts. Dozens of names. Dozens of young women reduced to entries in an account book. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "That's just our operation." Cartwright said, "There are 3 others like it between here and California. You've won one battle, Reed. But the war? The war is just getting started." The gunfire downstairs was tapering off, replaced by shouts of federal marshals. "And drop your weapons." Morrison's voice rose above the others. Taking control of the situation, Lydia moved to the window and looked down at the street. "It's over down there," she reported. Marshal Morrison's got them surrounded, but Wyatt was still staring at the ledger, at the names of women who'd vanished into slavery and worse. His hand shook with rage at the scope of what they'd uncovered. How many more? He asked Cartwright. How many other operations? Go to hell. Lydia knelt beside the wounded man, her derringer pointed at his head. He asked you a question, and I told him to go to hell. She pulled back the hammer with a soft click. Wrong answer. Cartwright's eyes went wide. This wasn't the terrified girl he'd tried to break. This was someone harder, colder, shaped by suffering into something dangerous. All right. All right. He held up his good hand. There are 4 others. 1 in Colorado Territory, 1 in Nevada, 2 in California. But they move around, change names, change locations. You'll never find them all. We'll see about that, Wyatt said. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and Morrison burst into the room with 2 deputies behind him. He took in the scene, quickly Cartwright bleeding on the floor, Wyatt and Lydia standing over him, the ledger in Wyatt's hands. Everyone all right up here? We're fine, Lydia said. But Marshal, you need to see this. She handed him the ledger, and Morrison's face grew darker with each page he read. Dear God, we knew it was bad, but this ... it's bigger than just these men, Wyatt said. Cartwright says there are 4 more operations like this one. Morrison nodded grimly. Then we'd better get started hunting them down. As they prepared to leave the Broken Wheel Saloon, Lydia paused at the top of the stairs and looked back at the room where she'd faced down her demons. The frightened girl who'd been stuffed in a burlap sack was gone forever, replaced by someone who'd found strength in the darkest places. Ready? Wyatt asked. She took his arm and smiled, not the broken smile of a victim, but the fierce smile of a survivor. Ready. Spring came early to Wyoming Territory that year, melting the snow from the high peaks and turning the prairie grass green with promise. The cottonwoods along Sweetwater Creek budded with new life, and wildflowers painted the hillsides in brilliant splashes of color. 6 months had passed since the raid on Fort Rock, and the reverberations were still being felt across the frontier. Marshal Morrison's investigation had expanded into a territory-wide operation, breaking up 3 more trafficking rings and rescuing 27 women. The ledger from the Broken Wheel Saloon had provided enough evidence to put 12 men behind bars and issue warrants for 12 more. But for Wyatt Reed and Lydia Sawyer, the most important changes were happening much closer to home. The ranch house had been rebuilt and expanded, with new windows that let in more light and a larger kitchen where the smell of fresh bread often filled the air. The bullet holes from that desperate fight had been patched and painted over, but the memories remained not as scars, but as reminders of what they'd survived together. Lydia stood at the kitchen window, watching Wyatt work with a new colt in the corral. She wore a simple blue dress, one she'd sewn herself from fabric they'd bought in Cheyenne, and her hair caught the morning sunlight like spun gold. The bruises and rope burns were long healed, leaving only the faintest of marks on her wrists. But the real healing had gone much deeper than the skin. She'd changed in the months since Fort Rock, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less frequently now, and when they did, she had Wyatt there to chase them away. More importantly, she'd found her own strength, the kind that came not from never falling down, but from learning how to get back up. A letter had arrived from Marshall Morrison the week before, updating them on the ongoing investigation. They'd located the Colorado operation and arrested its leaders. The Nevada ring had dissolved when word of the Fort Rock raid reached them, its members scattering to the wind. The California operations were proving more elusive, but Morrison was confident they'd track them down eventually. Justice was slow but steady, grinding forward like a mill wheel. Each arrest, each rescue, each trafficking ring destroyed represented lives saved and families reunited. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had already been done, but it was a start. The sound of approaching horses drew Lydia's attention to the main road. A small wagon was coming up the trail, driven by a woman she didn't recognize. As it drew closer, she could see that the driver was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a determined set to her shoulders. Wyatt. She called out, "We have company." He finished with the colt and walked over to meet the wagon, Lydia joining him. The woman who climbed down was travel-worn but dignified, her clothes dusty from the road but well-made. She carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that Lydia recognized immediately. "Are you Wyatt Reed?" The woman asked. "I am." "This is my wife, Lydia." They'd married in February in a simple ceremony at the church in Sweetwater Station. Judge Harrison had performed the service, with Marshall Morrison and his wife standing as witnesses. It had been a quiet affair, but the joy was real, the kind that came from two people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light together. "My name is Rebecca Crawford," the woman said. "I've come from Colorado. Marshall Morrison told me you might be able to help." "What kind of help?" Lydia asked, though she was already beginning to suspect. "My sister. She was taken 6 months ago, outside of Denver. The Marshall's people found the men who took her, but Sarah... They'd already sold her. Moved her somewhere else." Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. "Marshall Morrison said you understood what that meant. Said you might know how to find her." Lydia and Wyatt exchanged glances. They'd had this conversation before, late at night when sleep wouldn't come and the weight of all those names in Cartwright's ledger pressed down on them. They'd talked about what came next, about whether their part in this fight was over or just beginning. "Come inside," Lydia said gently. "We'll make some coffee, and you can tell us everything." They sat around the kitchen table while Rebecca told her story. It was heartbreakingly familiar, a wagon train attack, men with guns and ropes, a young woman vanishing into the nightmare of human trafficking. Sarah Crawford was 19, a schoolteacher who'd been traveling west to take a position in a mining town. She'd been planning to send for Rebecca once she was settled. The Marshall's people tracked the men who took her to a place called Silver Creek, Nevada, Rebecca continued. But when they got there, the operation was already gone. "Someone tipped them off. And you think Sarah was moved with them," Wyatt said. "I know she was." One of the men they arrested in Colorado told the marshal that pretty girls were worth more in California. Said they'd ship the best ones west. Rebecca's hands clenched around her coffee cup. "She's still out there somewhere. Still alive. I can feel it." Lydia reached across the table and covered Rebecca's hands with her own. "We'll help you find her." "Lydia," Wyatt said quietly, "we should talk about this." "No, we shouldn't." Her voice was firm, settled. "This is what we do now, Wyatt. This is who we are." He looked at his wife, strong, determined, unafraid, and felt that familiar surge of pride and love. She was right, of course. They'd been changed by their experiences, shaped into something new and purposeful. They couldn't go back to the simple life of ranching in isolation, not when there were women like Sarah Crawford still out there, still needing help. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this smart. We work with Morrison, follow the law, keep ourselves safe." "Agreed," Lydia said. "Rebecca, do you have any other leads? Anything else the marshal told you?" Rebecca reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a folded paper. It's a list of places the Colorado operation had connections to. Saloons, brothels, mining camps where they sold girls. Marshal Morrison's people are checking them out, but there are so many ... double quotes. Wyatt studied the list, recognizing some of the names. California was a big territory, and there were 100 places a woman could disappear. But they'd found Lydia against worse odds, and they'd broken up the Fort Rock ring when everyone said it couldn't be done. "We'll need supplies," he said. "Horses, provisions for a long journey. And we'll need to let Morrison know where we're going. How soon can we leave?" Rebecca asked. "Day after tomorrow," Lydia said. "That'll give us time to get ready and make arrangements for the ranch." As evening fell, they sat on the porch watching the stars come out over the Wyoming hills. Rebecca had accepted their offer of a bed for the night and was inside writing a letter to send back to her family in Colorado. "You sure about this?" Wyatt asked, taking Lydia's hand in his. "Surer than I've ever been about anything." She leaned against his shoulder. "I keep thinking about that ledger, all those names. How many sisters like Rebecca are out there, wondering what happened to their loved ones? Could be dangerous. The California operations are bigger, more organized. Then it's good we're getting better at this too." He smiled at that. They had indeed gotten better at planning, better at fighting, better at working together. The scared rancher and traumatized girl who'd met in that storage shed were gone, replaced by a partnership forged in fire and tempered by shared purpose. Besides, Lydia added softly, "I know what it's like to be where Sarah is right now. Afraid, alone, thinking no one's coming for you. If we can be the ones who prove that wrong, ... then we do it," Wyatt finished. Together, the next morning brought word from town that another woman had gone missing from a wagon train near Laramie. Marshal Morrison was forming a new task force to investigate, and he wanted their help done as they prepared for their journey to California, loading supplies and checking their weapons. Lydia felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. This was her life now, not the quiet existence of a rancher's wife she'd once imagined, but something harder and more dangerous and infinitely more meaningful. She'd been saved from that burlap sack for a reason. Now she knew what that reason was. Standing in the yard where she'd once been afraid to step outside, watching Wyatt saddle their horses for another rescue mission, Lydia Sawyer Reed smiled at the irony of it all. She'd come west looking for a new life, and she'd found it, just not in the way she'd expected. Sometimes the best destinations were the ones you never planned to reach. As they rode out toward the setting sun, 3 figures against the vast Wyoming sky, Lydia thought about the words Wyatt had spoken that first night. "Nobody's taking you anywhere. You have my word on that." He'd kept that promise. But more than that, he'd helped her find the strength to keep it for herself and for every other woman who needed someone to ride to their rescue. Behind them, the ranch house sat quiet and peaceful in the evening light, waiting for their return. But ahead lay the open road, and somewhere at the end of it, a sister waiting to be found. The work wasn't finished. It might never be finished, but it was good work, and they were good at it. And that was enough. The end.